till the end, which is next Wednesday, when our final lecture is going to be given by Janet Bailey. And please don't miss it, because she knows photographs. Tonight our guest is the eminent Bruce Connew.
That's all switched on and ready to go. Hello. Hello. What I'm going to do in true Virgo style is be very logical and chronological, starting from 1976 or a bit before, and then working through to what I've been doing lately. I'll put an image up on the screen, which is one that goes back to 1976. That doesn't. Life was like that in 76. That's better. I can't see very well with that sharp on it. Yeah. I'll start with how I got into photography, just briefly. Like everyone else, I bought a camera second-hand and I think a 50mm lens and a 300mm lens, and used mostly the 300mm lens. I did a trip around Australia in 1972, and that I drove with my wife then right around Australia, and that was the beginnings of the photography, and this is where I used the 300mm lens and photographed at a distance and really didn't make any contact with people. But that was the germ, and I remember in Perth going to a library and looking up the old photography annuals, and in the back they would have advertisements for art schools in England, and I wrote off to all these art schools in England and received replies, and decided when I came back to New Zealand that I would go off to England, and because I didn't know of Elam or John Turner or Tom Hutchins or any of those people at that stage, or any other photographers really in New Zealand. And I thought that the only place that I could begin to learn something sensible about photography was at an art school, which were available in England as far as I knew. I eventually went to the West Surrey College of Art and Design, which was in Guildford, the Guildford Art School, which was a 3-year course. And I spent a year there and really didn't think that I learnt too much. But looking back on it, certainly technically I became a little below competent. But what that art school gave me was a library. They had the most magnificent library, just perhaps as good as Elam's library here. And it gave you the opportunity to look at photographs, read about photographers, read about photography, read about the philosophy of photography, read about art, all of that. And most of the time I spent in the library reading books or looking at photographs. From there I went on to Australia to do the first, what I see as the first sort of major or important thing, important documentary. And this was on a small community about 1,000 miles northwest of Perth, called Roebourne, which was one of several up there, Roebourne, Fitzroy Crossing and Halls Creek, which were very sad places. Roebourne had an Aboriginal population of about 500, most of whom were severely affected by alcoholism, and 95%, the local doctor said, were ravaged with syphilis. And from what I understand, Roebourne is not really any different now. These were the first, a couple of images from that period. It was a period that it was a learning process for me in a way that I had come out of art school reading a lot of books, but actually being fascinated with one particular book by a photographer called David Douglas Duncan. The book was Yankee Nomad. And this gave, Duncan was a photographer, a photojournalist, if you like, who had photographed for life and all around the world. And it was told in a very romantic sort of way. And I was terribly impressed by this. And setting off from Perth to Roebourne, I remember I hitched a ride in a truck, and I can remember thinking that this was it. I was a full-time photographer. Getting to Roebourne, those sort of romantic notions quickly disappeared when I actually had to get out on the street and start taking photographs of a situation that I'd come across in 1972, which was on this first trip around Australia. And my wife and I had stopped at Roebourne. We were going to stay the night there and have a bite to eat. And we stopped at a little sidewalk cafe and we ordered sausages and chips. We both had shorts on because it was very hot. And during that, as the chips arrived, another chap came up beside us and started. We could feel a splashing, and we turned around. He was peeing against the side of the cafe. And then we turned around after we'd finished eating, and an Aboriginal woman walked out of the hotel across the road. It was a dirt street, and was beaten up in the middle of the street by two other Aboriginals who had walked from this side across. So Roebourne had stuck in my mind, and that was the first of that type of social thing that I'd ever come across. It was all very new to me. So going back in '76, after England, and England also was very much a growing period, where coming away from New Zealand at the age of about 22 or 23 I think, and to that stage playing rugby and going to pubs and doing all the normal sorts of things at that stage. And going to arriving in London and arriving at a very elite group of flats called, I can't remember the name now, but they were very elite and very expensive and very affluent. And I remember going into those, and we went in there to see the porters because I was looking for a job at that stage. And we went beneath, underground, and saw where the Irish custodians lived. And these were below these very opulent establishments above. And they lived in little hovels below with no windows where light bulbs needed to be on. That was all new to me at that stage, probably not to a lot of other people, but it certainly was to me. And that was the beginnings of Roebourne coming back into my mind and thinking about that. And eventually, 3 years later, leaving England and going back to Roebourne to photograph. I'll continue with the chronology. The photographs with those photographs, I came back to New Zealand, and I put them together and wrote an article as well about Roebourne and the situation there, and that material was published in The Listener, which was my first connection with The Listener magazine. And from there on, I think I went down where I met Adrian Martin and started work at the Otago Daily Times, which was one of the options as a photographer that I had. And we didn't get on terribly well, and I stayed there about 2 weeks, I think, wasn't it, Adrian, or something like that, and came rushing back to Auckland, and I continued with my own projects. I went up to Tonga and photographed up there for a couple of months. I photographed helicopter deer shooting, different things around New Zealand, most of which was published in The Listener, and that brought on this connection with The Listener. This was part of a story that I was photographing on the Auckland Zoo, or my interpretation of the Auckland Zoo. This was another Listener story. Most of the material now is Listener material. I'll come on to the Listener fairly quickly because that really was a turning point in my photographic life, if you like. I was very reluctant. Is that sharp? The image is sharp. I was very reluctant to join the Listener. I was happily selling books at this stage, which I'd been doing for about 3.5 years and just doing things for the Listener on a part-time basis. I was asked whether I would commit myself more to the work for the Listener, and said that I wouldn't. And then about 9 months later, the same proposition was put, and finally we spent 3 months sorting through contracts, and I agreed to join them. I was reluctant, I suppose, because at that time there was always a battle of photographers to get into this. I was reluctant because several things. One, I knew that it would change things personally for me, but also I knew that the enormous battles that Robin Morrison had at the magazine and trying to get his work used well or appropriately. So I was really only persuaded to join. But once I decided to join, I saw the Listener as an end in itself. What it gave me was an opportunity to explore people, explore issues, explore photography, explore myself in many ways. It was a whole learning process, and it gave a key to that door. Meeting people like Spike Milligan, and part of there were sort of two areas of work for the Listener. One was the portrait work, of which this is, and the other was the more essay journalistic sort of story work. I'll go through a series of portraits here. I particularly like that because Spike, who just before we arrived, I think the Women's Weekly had been there or someone else had been there, and they'd had him dressed up as a jockey and running down the road with a whip with his silks on and hat, and he was a little bit annoyed about the whole thing. But he's always struck me as I'm pretty sure he's a manic depressive. I'm not sure. Is that true? But he's in this portrait. I think you wonder just which side he's actually on at present. There's a sort of craziness there, and he could be just being silly. I don't know. That's Christina Conrad. A little bit the same, I think.
Bruce, what special qualities do you think that you've got and that photographers need to arrest such good portraits from people?
Goodness, Rhondda. I was thinking about that coming in tonight, wondering how I actually get the portraits that I get. One, I spend time, sometimes like with Helen Caldecott, I think I got about 3 minutes. With Spike, there was about an hour, but I suppose I'm not trying to set them at ease. I'm not trying to make them comfortable. I'm not trying to be patronising. I just go in there, and I'm going in there to take a photograph, whether they like it or not. In some ways, I'm not trying to be their friend, or I'm not trying to annoy them either. I'm intensely interested by a lot of the people that I've photographed. Christina Conrad I find extraordinary, just extraordinary. But I've found that with a lot of other people as well. In some ways, I'm demanding. Christina was very, very concerned about being photographed, didn't want to be photographed. But I don't make any allowances for that. I just am assertive in a way that I say I am going to photograph you. But their response to the camera, whether they find it uncomfortable or whether they enjoy it or whatever, to me is as valid a statement about the person as anything else. So I'm not trying to look for a happy one or a sad one or anything like that. It's just the way it turns out. And sometimes that might take hours, other times it might take minutes. I remember Dorothy Butler, I think we spent the whole day together just wandering around talking. It just became fascinating. Titi Tihu, who is a tohunga from down Taumaranui, this was 3 days in making this one. And there are special reasons for that that I won't go into because they involve another photographer before me. But finally, Titi just said at one stage, after we'd been waiting around and talking and being threatened and told that if any photograph was misused, I would be 6 foot under, and I absolutely believe him. And he said, "Okay, let's go." And he went to the most sacred part of the Wanganui River for him, and took off all his clothes except his shorts, and went into the river and stood like that. It happened, and all I had to do was take the photograph. Naomi Longi. I still can't see whether these are sharp or not. Are they staying? Are they sharp?
Yeah,
You're doing a good job. With Naomi, it was. I said that I wanted to photograph her and come and spend a day with her. Not looking for an essay, but just looking for a portrait of her. And we took all sorts of things, and she was going shopping. I think she had to take one of the kids up to the local medical centre. And we did that, and then she zipped to the chemist to get the prescription. And I waited outside, and fortunately everyone came by. And just got that, which I really like. I like those sort of spontaneous things happening and being able to actually do it. Different situations again. Quite often in the listener you would go out with a journalist. On this occasion it was Tony Reid was the journalist, and Tony never enjoyed a photographer coming along with him, and you would only go with him if it was absolutely essential. Now Crump didn't want to be interviewed, so we knew that it was going to be a bit difficult, and that I would have to go along with Tony. So Tony sat down there and interviewed him, and I had a tripod because we didn't want to use flash, and there was just a light bulb, and I stood not far away with a tripod and a 50mm lens, or a 50 I think, and shot off about 3 rolls of film because I just wasn't getting anything that seemed right. And this one I think was on the last roll of film, the last few shots that I took. And it just seemed a right one. He was just about to leave Auckland and head for Opotiki at that stage. But Tony, this was another thing about the listener. And joining the listener, it gave you access to some very fine journalists and very very strong minds, and I would certainly put Tony Reid as one of those. But the opportunity to actually go out with them and listen to them, and listen to the way they interviewed, and Tony would have a main theme and could interview along that main theme, and would allow himself. And you notice the difference between journalists as well, and you notice those who are, and I've been out with all sorts, those who are very uncomfortable or not very secure. But Tony would allow himself to be taken off on a tangent, and he would explore that whole tangent and then come back to the main thread and keep on going, waiting to be taken off again. And it was a wonderful process, listening and watching him do this whole thing. And he never used tape. He always wrote, and he would just be writing furiously and would get dialogue word perfect. It was extraordinary. This was before a march, I think, in 1985, for a story that it could have been Tony Reid again, actually, did on John Minter. The other part of the listener, as I said, was the essay part, and the listener gave you the opportunity to come up with your ideas and then go off and explore those ideas. I make the listener sound wonderful. There were enormous difficulties as well, I assure you. But one of the ones that I did was on a new intake of army recruits, and what I wanted to do was follow that first week where they actually go in as individuals and then become a group. And these are one or two of the photographs from that. He's painting the stones. I was in the camp commandant's office at the time, and we were discussing what I wanted to do the next day. I think it was interesting because the army gave me complete freedom. I was allowed to talk with anyone. I was allowed to ask the new intake of recruits anything, and they were told that they could answer whatever they liked. So I asked them things like, did they want to kill? And there were several that did. We're quite happy about it. But there was that opportunity in this particular one to have complete access. I was allowed to go anywhere in my area, photograph anything, and be anywhere, open any doors, go anywhere. And I don't think they'll probably ever allow it again.
What are those little knots up on the trees?
They're helmets. There are 3 soldiers there on the parade ground, yeah. And that's, and the Sergeant Major is just further along with that tree. Another story that I did, I also wrote stories for these two, the punks and for the soldier boys, which is the intake of army recruits. So it was sort of combining the two, which was an interesting process. I found them very complementary, that the photographs and the words worked well together. But it's an enormously difficult thing to do. I found it took an enormous amount of effort. The punks, I spent about a month with them, and again, this was the opportunity that the listener gave you, was to spend this sort of time. I don't know whether they do now, but you could spend this sort of time doing other jobs in between, but being free to wander off. And this was at the Easter show. It just strikes me as who's normal in this world. And that was all part of the punks thing, was being with them. Even though I was dressed perhaps as I am now, you were lumped in with them if you were in their group. And here there was a confrontation not long after this around the corner, and because I was taking photographs, I was pushed and shoved along with them, and they were pushed over and punched. And, it's just what struck me was that their different appearance brought antagonism. Some of the difficulties at the listener were involved with the use of photographs mostly. And I think I've come to the conclusion that it's those difficulties are inevitable in any magazine. I worked really hard at the listener to alter that situation, and discovered that finally you can't. You can have some influence on how your photographs are used, but finally you can't have complete control. And that's what I was demanding, and that's why there were continuing difficulties throughout the whole period. And I know Robin had the same thing, and I always saw the listener as a sort of 2 to 5 year period for me. And I think we lasted 3 years and left mutually fed up with each other, I think. But probably leaving the listener and being able to look back at it, in some ways I feel a lot more kindly towards them, realising that they fit into a certain mould. And if you don't like that mould or don't feel that you fit into that mould, then what you do is leave. There are other considerations beyond your photographs or beyond the issue that you were working on or beyond the portrait. There are commercial considerations, and I think I've finally accepted that of magazines and intending to work beyond them. And I'm finding also that last year the work that I did was photographing coal miners, underground coal miners down in the South Island, and I found the enormous freedom of being away from a magazine and just being able to photograph the way that I felt I should be photographing, and photographing situations that were not connected to a narrative or connected to a story, that were just part of a sort of vague theme or a specific theme. That freedom was wonderful. I wasn't, I don't think, and looking back at the work, I don't think I was indulgent with that freedom, but it just gave me the opportunity to take photographs that I would not have taken otherwise.
What exactly was it about the use of the photographs by the listener that you objected to?
Okay, quite. I could probably mention a few specific examples, but I'm hesitant to do that. What happened if I worked on a particular story? A journalist would do his or her effort, and they would approach it along the lines of their thoughts, the way they saw it on a particular theme. Photographically, that's how I approached it as well. But that, in some ways, was a new way of, not so much a new way of thinking, but something that wasn't quite as acceptable. A writer having an opinion was more acceptable than a photographer having an opinion. So the battle was to encourage the theme or the opinion that I photographed to be used, enhancing that theme or opinion, rather than just using the photographs as illustrations of the text or echoing the text. And that's where the difficulties cropped up. And I think it was not so much because there was an antipathy towards that approach. I think there was a lack of understanding that this approach was appropriate. And I say that because you would hand photographs over. For example, let's use one. I remember photographing the Royal Tour. And I said that I would like to do a layout because I'd approached the Royal Tour photographing the people who came out to see the Royals, the types of people and how they fitted into New Zealand, which I think was better than just going out to photograph the Royals, or more appropriate, certainly for the listener. I did a layout and it was sent down and it was changed by the designer and the sub-editor who worked on it. And there were some problems with it, such as a colour photograph was used across 2 pages, but they'd forgotten that the right-hand page was actually a black and white page. Things like that happened. They later apologised about the layout they came up with, which was a traditional, this is the Royals layout, which was about the only apology that I've ever had, I think. But it was that sort of problem. And all that arose from was a misunderstanding of what I was trying to do. Perhaps the way that I approached those misunderstandings was aggressively, and that tended to turn people off and not want to listen anymore. I'm a little less aggressive now. These 2 photographs here, one was taken in 1985, just to show how the approach has changed a little. That was taken in 85, and the other was taken in 1981. One of the stories I did for the listener was New Caledonia. And this is going up to New Caledonia, which came at my suggestion at the listener, seemed to tie in with my sort of personal exploration, things that I was actually learning about. what was happening in New Caledonia at the time. I think David Roby had been up there at around election time in 1984, and I went up there with Vernon Wright at the end of 1984 in December, mid-December, December 11. And I've been asked numerous times why I wanted to go to New Caledonia, and it was at this stage, New Caledonia and then going on to South Africa later, began to make it quite clear that a lot of what I'd been doing throughout, since 1976, were photographing social issues, not so much as a sort of crusade, but as a personal exploration. I was there learning about them, and this was my way of actually learning. Other people read books or read the newspapers or go to lectures, but this was my way of actually learning. This photography just gave you this key to actually go out and explore. New Caledonia cropped up, and it cropped up at a time, what was happening there cropped up at a time that I was wanting to learn more about racial issues and how they connected with New Zealand. And this is where South Africa tied in as well a little bit later. And what I've discovered, and sort of felt this through South Africa, was that all the work that I've been involved in is linked, and by that I mean that New Caledonia is linked to South Africa. They're both linked to New Zealand. They're both linked to the Hikoi in 1984, which I photographed. They're linked to the Aboriginal stuff that I've photographed. They're even linked to the coal miners and timber mills, which are representative, if you like, of colonial use of land. Everything has not become clearer, but I can see that there are links in all the work that I'm doing. And this wasn't a conscious effort at all. It was more instinctive. The time that we went was the time that Mashiro had his encampment up in Tio, and was taking back their land. I don't have a photograph of him in here, but he was shot about 2 weeks after we left. But they were setting up roadblocks. Most people, I imagine, have followed it on news. This was in the encampment. The other thing, when you're photographing, you come across wonderful ironies, and a lot of the food on the table is French. Pockets of Paris in Numia. This was in Tio. Tio had become deserted, really, and most of the French Caldoche and Colon had gone back to Numia, but the army were patrolling. This is where you begin to understand magazines. Paris Match, which is really a right-wing magazine. This was an article on these people that we were photographing in the encampment, and we'd got hold of a copy of it, and it brought it up to show them. And we were the only journalists and photographers that had been allowed into the camp of anyone in the whole time. And we took this up to them, and they read it, and they hadn't seen a journalist from very much at all, and it was they said that it just wasn't true, a lot of it, sensationalising the events again. This is one of the dangers in particularly international photojournalism or documentary photography, if you're wanting to use magazines as a vehicle for communication. actually being at the listener and realising that you can't have complete control is one thing, but there's no way that if you send photographs to an agency overseas and they sell them to Paris Match or Libération, which is a left-wing newspaper, that you have any control over the use there. So the photographs that you take, which might be sympathetic to your particular opinion or way of thinking, could be used in the completely opposite way in the magazine. And that difficulty I still haven't really come to terms with. This chap was a pig farmer who had had land up around Canala, which is where Chereau had a stronghold through Tio, Canala, that whole area. And he'd actually been allowed to stay. He was told that he could keep his land because he'd always worked in with the Kanak people. The next sort of major thing that I did, major thing for me, was South Africa. And I'd left the listener by this stage because there'd been difficulties about going to South Africa, and eventually linked up with the listener journalist Vernon Wright in South Africa. And I arrived on the day that they declared the emergency before this emergency. So the photographs we took were at that first 5 weeks of the emergency. Looking back on it, it seems such an incredibly short time, but when we were there, it was such an intense period of photographing and exploring, and it seemed much longer. But when people ask me how long were you there, and there's a book coming out on this later this month with a text by Vernon Wright and 62 photographs of mine, where I had complete control. And I say 5 weeks, it just sounds such a ludicrously short period of time. And I sort of think very much of the other photographers. South Africa has a very strong documentary tradition that is probably not known outside of South Africa, other than photographers like Mugabane or David Goldblatt. But there are a whole group of other photographers there, some who are sort of mediocre but are out there photographing in the same way that every photographer and his dog went out and photographed during the 81 Springbok tour. And there were wonderful photographs came out of all of that, and important photographs. Well, in the same way, that's happening in South Africa now. There are a lot of photographers photographing all the time, and everything's being recorded. And although we mightn't see a lot of it now, I think one day a lot will be seen. These were two, I'll take you through it quite quickly. These were two villages. We started off photographing two villages that were under threat of forced removal. And forced removal, it was said by the government, was no longer a law or anything that actually happened in South Africa. And we were told that government land officials would actually come up to these two villages, Motlantla and Matopistan, and tell them that they had to leave. And this is what we're photographing here. This is a meeting between the government land officials and this is Motlantla village. And those are the government land officials. The number on the back of on the door of the building was put there about 5 years ago, and that by the government land officials. And this designated buildings that were to be demolished, and they were put all around the whole village. It was an intimidation tactic, and that's, although the laws say that forced removals don't happen now, there is the same sort of intimidation tactic, perhaps not too dissimilar to here in a way. Remember when the motorways go through and people are required to actually leave their homes and they don't want to. And somehow I see links like this, although they're not parallel, there are links between South Africa and New Zealand, but all the other places that I seem to have photographed as well. be very Maori. This was the chief's house at Matlatla. Gold miners. One of the things that is constantly bandied about in journalism and photography as well, but mostly journalism, but if we can include photography within that, is objectivity. And this was also part of that difficulty at the listener in a way, in having an opinion as a photographer. And I've never tried to hide my opinion or bias or whatever. And it cropped up very early. I remember with the zoo story that we did. Phil Gifford wrote a story which was really a verbatim account of what the director of the zoo said, which was very positive about zoos. And I'd gone around and picked out the jailed aspect of the zoos in about 4 or 5 photographs, and letters poured into the listener about my bias and that the photographs didn't hang with the text. But I've never felt that that's my problem. That's a problem of the magazine to put them together. And I've often felt that objectivity, in the way that I've seen it, has been very much an excuse for journalistic laziness and not going out there and actually, first of all, questioning and challenging themselves, and seeking answers and looking at things, but also not writing or photographing in a way that is going to challenge others as well. So it's very much, I see it very much as a bias of the status quo, very much a bias of the publisher. And that's how I feel that my work is very much a personal exploration, and I've never tried to offer it as anything else.
Are these all pictures from your new book?
Yes, yeah, they'll all be in there. It's not all of them, but this is an edited version. Rhondda didn't want me to show too many slides. This was a single men's hostel in Soweto. And there were no showers or baths in the hostel. This is in Soweto itself. I see I didn't get the Auckland Star today, but I see that that there's going to be a World 15 going to South Africa, is that? From the speculation, is it? This image here was came about after this image was one of the first times that I was challenged by a South African black. We had very good contacts, Vivian and I, in South Africa. We were able to get access to almost anywhere black that we wanted to go. I spent quite a bit of time in Soweto, and I asked to go to homes, and apart from the initial awkwardness, I was eventually pulled over fences and dragged into homes to photograph, and it was wonderful. This chap here, I was photographing the 2 gentlemen sitting down, and this other chap walked around the corner. And I kept photographing, and he came over. I haven't got the sequence here, but he came over and shook hands with both men, took his hat off. Children came out of the door, and there were words spoken. It was quite a formal sort of introduction. And then eventually the chap on the left stood up, and this man from Lesotho sat down, and he turned around to me and said, "You have insulted me." and then stood up again, which concerned me because he was about 6'6". But I said, just a moment, I'll get someone who can explain. And he said, I don't want anyone else to explain, I want you to explain. And I began to explain what I was doing and who I was. And he was very antagonistic for about 20 minutes and then finally said, did you want the All Blacks to come to South Africa? And I said, no, I didn't. And he reached out and shook hands. But there was amongst the blacks, there was a very strong awareness of the All Blacks, that they didn't want the tour, that they want boycotts. They're very, very politicised, right the way down to 5-year-olds. They know what's going on, and they know that they will be the ones that will change it. The chap on the left was, just probably to spoil the photo for some, was a policeman, a black policeman, who are normally targets in South Africa. And I was taken to this house, and when I went in and was introduced, he had a gun and kept bringing out his gun and flashing it around the place, and he was drunk as well. And I said that I would like to take a photograph of him with his gun, and it just went straight back inside. The other chap was called Smith, and he was a photographer, and one of the people who was photographing just quietly in Soweto.
The policeman, does he live inside Soweto?
Yes, he does. A number of them live within, I don't know whether it's most, I'm not sure, but I know quite a few perhaps, lived within a barrack sort of arrangement, particularly with the situation as it was then, and probably still is now. And there were ironies at every corner as well.
Did you see some of the photographs of the photojournalist Smith?
No, not of Smith, no. I saw there's a group there called Afropix that work in Johannesburg, and they've put out calendars, and I remember buying half a dozen calendars and sending them back here to different people. But there are books that turn up every now and then from those people that I've seen. I think more and more will eventually be seen. Again, what has crept into my work more and more, and this is sort of understood with the coal miners, is a thematic approach, and this was developed, I think, quite strongly at the Listener, although there wasn't the opportunity at the Listener to continue working in themes without having to work in a sort of narrative way as well. The sort of nanny black and white theme was one that I pursued, not consciously but instinctively in South Africa. I didn't set out to photograph for a book or for a magazine or anything like that. It was just a matter of looking and photographing. And in putting it all together, I remember when the exhibition was being put together down in at the National Art Gallery, I laid out 100 large photocopies on the floor, and the exhibitions officer there, Louise Pether, was going to help me begin to put it together. And at the end of the day, I was just about in tears because it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't come together. And I rang Peter Black, who came down, and we spent the next 3 days. But on the first day that he came down, the next morning, within the first half hour, he had the first 8 photographs laid out in a sort of thematic sense, and then we just continued on from there. And I discovered the last exhibition I put together was in 1980, and it's still talked about as being a complete mess in shambles and not understood by anyone, least of all me. I think it was just trying to put together best images without worrying about where they fitted in with each other. But Peter, who's very experienced at that and puts an awful lot of thought into it, brought that to the South African exhibition, and it was a real lesson for me in how photographs can work together and can sort of take you up and bring you down and follow along on a particular theme, or and work on that sort of group thematic level as well as work on an individual photo level, and then work on another level as a simple sort of narrative, which the South Africa exhibition had. The narrative was pretty straightforward and not necessarily there to be picked up by anyone, but it was there just quietly behind, and I think the individual images could be picked up, and then I think the groups, there were about 8 groups altogether, could be linked in to provide a sort of complete picture. So by the end of it, you would come out with a feeling of what I actually saw. This was at Davyton, which was a very tense funeral. It was a funeral for 4 teenagers who had been shot at a previous funeral by police. And the police were here and troops and great concentrations. There was a large contingent of journalists and photographers. And it was the first occasion, the first funeral that had come up after the edict had been given that no one was to walk. There was to be no funeral procession, that everyone was to go from the home of the deceased to the cemetery in a vehicle to prevent a political march. And on this occasion, the young people, teenagers and early 20s, of whom there were probably about 1,000, said that they were going to walk. And the police said, well, if you walk, we'll stop you. And everyone knew what that meant. And finally, Tutu was there as well, and finally it was diffused. I think about 8 buses turned up, and all sorts of other vehicles carried the people to the cemetery. But it was very, very tense, and on this occasion they were dancing in the middle of the road and were told that if everyone was told to get off the road, otherwise they would be shot. And what they did is move just off the road to the front lawn of a house and started chanting ANC freedom songs and dancing, and just walking a very thin line. But you came to see that death was an accepted fact of life. The risk of being killed didn't stop you from going out and protesting or even singing ANC freedom songs, which was illegal. The next section, this was the third to last photograph of the exhibition. There were seven photographs that made the ending that opened at the National, and when it finally got to Auckland, the exhibition, I took 5 of those photographs out. I'll show you how it ended at Auckland, and then I'll show you the other photographs we took out and the reasons why. This was what's called a necklace killing in South Africa. And it was the body there is of a Ciskei soldier. That's the second to last picture of the exhibition and of the book, and that's the last picture. Now the pictures we left out, the other 5 we took out, I felt were good images and created a sort of sequence of this whole necklace event. But when several people, Peter Black, myself, people like Bruce Foster, Glenn Bush, talked about the ending, we've decided that it was placing an undue emphasis on that particular aspect of South Africa in the context of all the other photographs. So we reduced it to those last 2. making the point that this is happening and that South Africa is very much about life and death, without overemphasizing it with these images. This was the first image in the sequence, which was coming out from the village, and these are mostly police and troops coming out to recover the body. And they'd actually come to the village. It was a pretty tense sort of moment. They'd come to the village really for retribution, to kill. They said they'd come there to kill. But fortunately they listened instead. It was the second photograph. Then the one that was actually in the exhibition that you saw was the third photograph. This was the fifth photograph, I think. And that was about the third to last photograph, I think. No, the second to last photograph in the original sequence. But this is what I mean about juxtapositioning and use of photographs can be so critical, and was the difficulty that I felt with magazines, is that certain juxtapositionings can alter completely the meaning or the emphasis of a theme. And quite often that was done arbitrarily, in a way that that was more appropriate to a certain type of design to suit the designer, rather than the designer working with the theme. That's the end of South Africa, and just there are one set of photographs that I haven't got in here. I haven't got any coal miners, and the last 4 or 5 photographs I'm going to show. Something that I've begun to work on, that I'll work on over the next few years, is looking at the ordinariness of New Zealand. And the ordinariness of New Zealand really appeals to me. It's far more than the dramatic New Zealand, the dramatic landscape that we so often see in books. To me, I think the next one. The rough paddock, not properly fertilised and a bit swampy, is pure New Zealand to me, and I love it. I think New Zealand's fantastic. But that will be a project that I'll continue with over a long period of time. But I think it's something that hasn't really been approached, certainly not in book form anyway, at all. There's always been a concentration by photographers or publishers on the dramatic landscape of New Zealand. And to me, the ordinariness is dramatic. And that's all. I've also got, not in this carousel, but sitting in here, about 25 coal miners' slides. But that might be a bit too much for everyone. But if anyone does want to see them, please say so, and we can have a break perhaps and show them from there.
Please.
But please feel free to walk out. Okay. first series of slides I'll show on the coal miners, and there'll be two distinctive batches. One has got a greeny cast to it, and the other's got a sort of a browny greeny cast to it, I think. But the first lot were taken in 1981. I spent a month photographing coal miners down on the west coast, and with different interruptions, or different things happening, I wasn't able to get back again until last year. But last year I spent 5 months photographing coal miners and about 4 months photographing timber mills, 4 particular timber mills down on the west coast. And my initial idea was to create an exhibition. I'm having an exhibition in July at the Dowse, July next year at the Dowse, ostensibly on coal miners. But as I start to print them up, I'm finding that that the coal miners and the timber mill work can work together, and can work with a lot of the other stuff that I photographed while I was down there, things that I photographed from the car, or different places I went, different things I saw in shopping centres or whatever. And I'm now beginning to get the feeling that they'll all work together rather than just as a specific thing on coal miners. They're both about working the land or taking things from the land. And this has been very much a part of the West Coast. But as I've discovered through the photographs, that there are other clues to what the West Coast is and what the people are and who they are and why. And that includes coal miners and timber mill workers as much as people who work in factories down there or whatever. There are as many clues in other work that I've done besides photographing underground or in the timber mills. And this is although here you'll see just the coal miners, I think eventually I'll bring the timber mills and the other work and put it all together as one. And this is the opportunity that this project, if you like, or this approach to this type of project has given me, and why it is so different to working for a magazine. With the magazine, you're very much caught up, or I always was, very much caught up in that sort of narrative, the idea that you were telling some sort of story, whether it be one picture or half a dozen, or 20. Going down to the West Coast for a length of time, for a fairly lengthy time, gave you the opportunity to explore beyond those normal parameters that the magazine would set. And I think that's probably reflected in the work and in certain images that just wouldn't appear in a magazine as part of a story on coal miners or timber mills or the West Coast.
That first image that you showed there has always intrigued me. The pattern on his upper forearm looks as if it's been heavily touched up. Presumably that isn't added detail. Presumably that is just the pattern of dirt on his arm.
Yeah, this guy, Tony, was very, very muscular, very, very strong, and had enormous muscles, as you can see, in his arms. And he worked on the face and was shoveling coal at that stage. And brushing against the coal, as they do, the muscles that were out at that particular period formed the pattern. Sorry. Some of the photographs in this early lot are, for me now, a bit obvious. This one is a bit obvious, I find. And the difference in the second lot, I think you'll probably notice. And there'll be a lot of, I will use some photographs, like that first photograph from the first lot. A lot of them will be weeded out.
When you say obvious, what do you mean by that?
One that that you would expect, obvious in the sense that to explain it, let's compare it with the first one. The first image that I showed, I don't think is an obvious image. There's a little bit more to it. This is suggests hard work and has got that wave sort of motion to it. But I think, particularly in the other photographs that I've got, it doesn't work on other levels as well. It's stuck pretty.
There would be there's a cliche image.
That's the sort of thing I mean. Yeah, the sort of thing that coal mining was very well documented in the early part of the century, or quite well documented in the early part of the century. Not so much underground, but outside. Through the middle of this century, the documentation was very much national publicity studio, and that's when I say obvious. A lot of the work that they took at that time was very obvious, set up and cliche, and I think there's a far more sophisticated audience for photography now, and I think that the cliche is almost unacceptable, and I think this is sort of getting close, and that'll become more obvious with other images that I show a little later. Yeah. Of course, a cliche done well. This mine is closed now, like a lot of the mines. Was the escarpment mine up in Denniston. It's this sort of image that I'm going for more now, I think, Ian. Something that suggests something beyond what's actually happening or what the person is actually doing. Perhaps that you could work along the theme of difficulty or effort or confinement.
Was that image taken with available light? I mean, are these
No, they're all flash, on-camera flash. I chose to use direct flash. I didn't want to set up any lighting. I wanted it to be straight on and completely honest in a way. I suppose in 1981 I was going down there more to glorify coal miners, and they didn't need any fancy lighting as far as I'm concerned to make things look more difficult or whatever for them. It is a difficult life, but I think probably the difference there, or in 1981 to now, is that I'm less sentimental about it. In fact, taking great pains to avoid sentimentality. So that to me is getting a little more real, a little less sentimental. That was this entrance. This was the Sullivan mine, and I think they were told that around corporatisation time that they would have, I think it was 7 men would be working there, and I think everyone refused to go back to work. I'm not quite sure how that's resolved itself there. But at the time that I photographed, this was 1981, there would have been well over 100 men working there. That's granity. With all the houses facing away from the sea, facing the railway line. It's wonderful. Now we come into the work that I've been doing in last year, 1986. Some of these might be too dark to be seen. I think I've underexposed. I did them all today, and I think I underexposed them. I've got to stop. This is the Kiwi mine in the 10 Mile Valley. And there are extraordinary feats of engineering, which I'm sure wouldn't be found in a textbook on engineering. This the Kiwi mine goes right up to the top of what I would call a mountain, I suppose, by this winch system on railway lines. And they were wiped out. That whole thing, you can see the slip all around it, was completely wiped out about 18 months ago, 2 years ago now. And they rebuilt the whole thing. It's just extraordinary, the effort that's put into this. See, I think these are showing there's a different sort of look in a way. And it's not that I'm consciously setting out to do that, it's just perhaps the way that my photography has developed, or the way I think has developed over the last... Yeah, my level of involvement, would you say? Yeah. I think what I've always found confronting people in photography enormously difficult, but what doing it full time with the listener, I was able to practice the skills of overcoming that sort of shyness, if you like, and that it was interesting to go back in 1986 and photograph coal miners and feel not so much completely at ease, but completely confident that I could go in there and photograph. In 1981 I didn't feel confident. In fact, I remember the first 3 days I was down there, I wanted to hide and run home. But now I think it's just getting older and perhaps a bit more mature. There was no feeling that I couldn't photograph or that I would be overawed by the subject. Or that I felt a lot of the photographs that I took, I think probably looked very strange to the miners, or they wondered why I would take them. I was completely different from any other photographer that had ever been down there in the sort of approach, and they wondered why I was spending so much time. Most mines I spent about a weekend, about 5 days, whereas most people would come to a mine and spend about 2 hours, and they couldn't understand how there would be so much to photograph over that period of time, but were completely accepting of it. I mean, I made no concession to that attitude at all. I approached it with the idea that I would do it the way that I thought was right, whatever anyone thought. Whether the miners themselves would relate to a lot of these photographs, I don't know. I really don't know.
How do you feel about that as it's quite an interesting statement that you, and you've been very honest about it, that your statements are very personal statements. But what is that relationship between that statement, which is very personally yours, and those environments which you are photographing, which you are presenting a very specific view of, one might even say a white middle class view. I'm a white middle class male myself. Do you see what I'm asking?
No.
It's a question of our competence to portray things which are not always part of our own lives.
Yeah, sure.
Crossing social boundaries, all those things.
Yeah, I suppose the way that I've rationalised that, if you couldn't rationalise that, you wouldn't go out and photograph, I suppose, or people wouldn't write about things. But the way that I've rationalised it is that it very much is a personal exploration. I'm learning. And anything that I present is presented as represented by me. Now you might say, well, who cares about what you think? Which is quite fair. I don't think probably too many people. But I think that it's appropriate for me to photograph anything as long as that honesty of attitude is understood. That this is very much the way that I see coal miners, and it might not be the way coal miners see themselves. I imagine there will be images in here that they'll feel a little bit hesitant about. I've used as an example, I'll continue showing these, but one of the themes that I've picked on with coal miners is intimacy amongst males. Now in the 80s of men's groups and things like this, we were all learning to be intimate and give each other a hug. Coal miners have been washing each other's backs in showers for the last 100 years, unknown to most New Zealanders. They've actually been touching each other in the showers. That sort of intimacy in coal mines is carried on underground as well. There's a lot of touching between men underground. Now I can see that. I remember explaining this to the manager of the Strongman mine, lovely person, and as I was explaining it, he said, "Christ, don't portray them as a bunch of puffs." But the thing was that intimacy altered the moment they came out of the mine, the moment they came out of the bathhouse, I should say. Once they got onto the bus, it was straight back to being normal Kiwi guys, I suppose. That intimacy changed. And I think that deserves to be explored. Now, Vernon Wright is going to go down and write about the coal miners. And he is wanting to explore that theme as well, just to find out what the sexuality of that theme is, what the practicality of the theme is, just find out what it actually means, what it is. Now, the miners themselves, with one or two exceptions perhaps, probably won't be able to articulate what all that is, because the stock answer about washing backs in showers is that it's a practical thing to do. You get a dirty back, everyone washes each other's backs, it makes sense. But you go into a rugby shower, and I haven't been into one for a long, long time, but I remember when I was playing rugby years ago, that you might all pee on each other as part of the fun of being in the showers, but you would never wash each other's backs. You wouldn't touch each other. And I just find those themes fascinating. And I think in the 80s, it's a very relevant theme and a very interesting one. And that's just one theme to be explored in coal miners.
Bruce, you've mentioned to me in the past another link, that being that your grandfather was a coal miner on the west coast. Is that sort of major reason for being down there? Do you find yourself remembering things he may have told you or whatever?
No, not really. It's a link to the west coast, because my father was born there and worked in the mines for 6 months and then escaped. He actually left and joined the Navy. That interests me, the people who stay on and those who leave. My uncle stayed on and eventually became Chief Inspector of Mines for New Zealand. So there's a family link to the mines. But I don't feel like being a coal miner. I feel an empathy in some ways underground. I was very comfortable underground, and I understand the people. I enjoy the people. I don't always agree with their attitudes, but I've got an enormous amount of respect, not just for coal miners, but for West Coasters full stop. There are survivors, and I admire that enormously. And they've had a lot of shit thrown at them over the past 12 months alone, not taking into account the last 20 or 30 years. That doesn't mean that I agree with logging Remu or huge open cast mines. But I think with the coal miners there was more confidence to take photographs like this, where the miners themselves were completely perplexed. After that, I'm pretty sure Buck, who was down the hole, turned around and said, "Why did you take that?" And there's that.
It's hard to tell from back here, Bruce, because of the
Is it?
incident.
What a shame. But it's another area that I explored a lot down the mines were hands coming out of holes. I think the next one, which will be impossible to see, I think because it's so underexposed. But oh no, not quite. But hands coming out of holes, hands reaching for things like that drill, and the wrist of the hand almost being part of the drill in a way. The touching, the hands that touch each other. Those sorts of things I wasn't looking for in 1981. And I didn't go down with the thought of actually looking for those things. They just kept cropping up, and I would take the photograph. And I think that really comes from having photographed full time for the last 5 or 6 years. It's just being ready for things that might crop up in front of you. It's on the miners' bus going to Strongman through Dunolly. It's a retired miner, about 80 now, and this is in Reefton. See, that to me is as much about the West Coast as it is about coal miners or whatever. It fits in all sorts of different areas, but is vital to the whole look at coal miners or timber mills or the West Coast. Bit difficult to see too. It's very dark down there. May not be sharp. It's very difficult to focus underground, using that as an excuse, but it's very difficult to photograph, and you rely, or to focus, to actually get a point of focus, because all you're relying on is your lamp initially. And you've sort of got to look sideways and get your lamp shining onto the area you want to photograph and try and focus. But you rely pretty heavily on depth of field. And on this occasion, in 1986, I took down a much stronger flash to get a much better depth of field. I think so I could work at f11 rather than f5.6.
Didn't they query your flash? Was your flash proof?
Most of the mines on the west coast are non-gassy, so you can use a normal flash with just batteries in. But the gassy mines, you're not allowed to take batteries underground. Not even allowed to take a digital watch. So State Coal had a flame-proof flash unit, which was very good. It was good. The only fault with it, I mean, it's a very good flash unit, but the only fault was that it took 24 hours to recharge fully, and that 24 hours gave you 2 rolls of film. And, it became very frustrating. The last shot's a happy shot. And this again could fit into that that theme of intimacy. This was just a bit of horseplay. One of the guys coming down on a trolley from one part of Strongman down to another part of Strongman. They put stone dust on the roof to prevent explosions. And he had touched this. He was in the front of the trolley, and one of the games is to touch that, and it all floats down on the people behind. And he did this. He's only about 18. And they got down the bottom and they grabbed him, and there was a lot of slushy coal dust mud down the bottom. And this was getting dumped. But that again fits into that theme of intimacy. This was the trolley. It's amazing what you do when you don't think people are looking. The mines in many ways are very primitive. still in New Zealand. On the west coast, I think Huntly is. Well, Huntly doesn't quite know what it's doing at the moment, but there's some. It was quite automated mining there, in parts. There are still areas where they're using the banjo or shovel on the west coast. Most of it is hydro mining, where they pump in water and washes the coal out through a channel system, which they say is easy, but it's not. They think it is because it's easier than the shovelling work, but it's still an enormous effort. And that's the last image. That's been going on for 100 years. I think it's extraordinary. Okay, that's it. If anyone wants to ask any questions, please feel free. No, yeah, that's quite right. Just to use as an example, it's the way I talk about it is probably a bit more obvious than what you're meaning there, the sort of subtleties of it. There was a photograph I took of Stefan Lieper for the Listener for an interview that was done in Auckland. And in some ways, you're if you haven't met the person, you're influenced by everything that you've heard, by what happens when you first go in to meet the person and that whole sequence of events. And on this particular occasion, we arrived at the Social Credit then office in Newmarket, and he was in his office and could see the journalist and myself arrive. And his secretary came out of an office down here and walked out and said, hello, knew who we were, but said, who are you? We said, we're from the Listener. And she said, just a moment, I'll go and tell Mr. Lieper, and walked down and in full view told Mr. Lieper we were there. And he looked up and said, yes, I'll tell them I'll be 3 minutes. We could read his mouth. She came out and said, he'll be 3 minutes, and continued on working. And I thought, goodness me. And went in, and the journalist sat to one side, and he had this desk, an enormous wood-panelled desk, wooden desk with wood panelling on the front, and his whole office was wood-panelled as well. And it had a filing cabinet over to the side that had a very neat pot plant sitting on the top. And on top of the desk, it had been completely cleared and was just this blotter. And what I photographed was, or each time I put the camera up to photograph Stefan Lieper, his hands would come up and he would start talking the way I talk, I suppose. And then whenever I put the camera down, his hands went down again. So at one stage, he got out of sequence, and as my camera came up, his hands went down. And all that was there was this wooden desk with all the wood panelling behind. Stefan Lieper's hands down there, and all you could see of him was that much, and he was looking up in the air, and it looked ridiculous. And that was the image I put forward to be published. It seemed to say something about Stefan Lieper. And the journalist went berserk and said that it couldn't be used. Now, the journalist, whose name I won't mention, was a fairly strong left-wing journalist, and certainly one who believes in enormous amounts of subjectivity. And he rang me and said, look, that you can't use that photograph, and started reading me a lesson on objectivity. And I said, goodness me. And I said that I'd taken the same sort of photograph of Spike Milligan, which I'd photographed a couple of weeks before. And he said, oh yes, but that's fine for that sort of person, but you can't do it with a politician. And I said, well, I photograph people rather than politicians or it was just, finally, there was a big argument down there, and he wanted just a straight head and shoulders portrait used. But finally they went for a compromise and used one where Stefan Lieper had his hands up like this, which looked silly as well. But there's that difficulty. Now, in something like the Royal Tour, because we used that example before, and one of the photographs I took was out the back of the plane as an air hostess put lipstick on. And it was, in other photographs, I'd photographed them seeing people coming onto the plane. I'd photographed the Union delegates. And what I was trying to do was show that interaction. One of the problems was the effort required to interact with the public. And that's what I actually showed. That's what I photographed. That's right. That's what I photographed. Now, when it came time for that story to be laid out by the sub-editor in Auckland, I asked him specifically not to use the photograph of the air hostess putting lipstick on by itself, that it was only taken in the context of the others that I'd taken in the cabin, and that they were all to be used together, emphasising this contact with people and what was required and the effort, etc. What was finally used were two photographs of the union heads, or the employer advocate and the union head, top of the page, and the one other photograph that was used was the air hostess putting on lipstick. That sort of thing, unless you kept your finger on it, happened all the time. Now that's a more obvious one, but there are a lot more subtle ways of dealing with that. I laid out the Soldier Boys essay, which was about 4 pages. In fact, there was great consternation at the listener because it was my idea. I photographed it, I organised the whole thing, I wrote it, and then I said I wanted to lay it out, and they refused at that stage and said that it would be laid out in Wellington by the designer. Well, the designer, quite by coincidence, fell ill, and I was telephoned to say that it was being sent up to Auckland because it was now urgent, and it required a lot of effort. A lot of hard thought for people to put it together because it was such a big thing. And it came up to the chief sub-editor in Auckland, and he and I were to lay it out together, but they sent someone up from Wellington to oversee it because they were concerned about the degree of control that I was having. Now that was, I got a letter from the editor after all that saying that he thought it was wonderful, that the whole thing worked really well. But that was one of the few occasions where I had control. I don't think it's also a sort of practical thing. Just pure time doesn't allow the photographer to have the control that he might want or she might want over particular layouts or whatever. And these days, I probably care less about it because I don't have, despite what's happened at National Women's because of the Metro article, a great faith in magazines to communicate. I think communication comes about, you've got your magazines, you've got books, you've got movies, you've got word of mouth. I suspect word of mouth is a more powerful means of communication than a magazine. So it doesn't concern me quite as much. I'm quite happy in some ways. I did a thing for More magazine recently where I just handed over the photographs and said, well look, this is how I see it, and walked away and left it. And it doesn't concern me that much anymore. I'm more concerned about getting on and doing the projects now, and seeing magazines as a means of one income, and perhaps the opportunity to place something that you might think is important at some stage, rather than as an end in itself, which it was in the early days at the Listener. I didn't do any other work or didn't feel like doing any other, what every other photographer was doing who worked for magazines. They were doing their personal work. The documentary sort of style was always my thing. And that's why I went hell for leather at the Listener, trying to sort of get it all to work. Any other questions? Can we all get over?
I would argue that the standard of the list has gone down considerably since your stories have stopped appearing. Irrespective of
Very
what's
kind,
happening
John.
in your own life changes. And I think there's still a need for that kind of tough, opinionated way you went about getting your stories done. I think that's really important. And at present, the listener seems quite gutless in that respect. And I think that's a problem for the listeners, not for anything else.
Circulation's up though.
Why? But one of the things I noticed about tonight was, which is really quite surreal in a way, is seeing most of your pictures in the slide form out of the context of the printed page. And it's interesting that you decided not to show any spreads,
Yeah.
possibly assuming that we all read the listener, which is probably a gross assumption. But reaching out. But it struck me as, like for instance, I don't know how obvious it was to the audience that the very first picture you showed, the second picture you showed of Roburn with the two young Aboriginal girls in the kitchen, that one of the girls was picking at I think it was raw, wasn't it? A kangaroo.
A sheep, yeah.
Animal on the table. And I don't know how clear that was.
Mm.
It wasn't so clear from the back of the room. But it seems to me there's an awful lot of, for one thing I'd like to comment about the way you work is that you in fact do a lot of research into the things that you do photograph. And that you're very knowledgeable about that. And this lecture format hasn't perhaps given you enough rope, because you can spend the whole evening talking about one story basically.
Yeah.
And I just like to let people know that.
Yeah, talking about the research, I suppose one of the things that I found with listener journalists, and this is of the better listener journalists, people like Tony Reid, Marcia Russell, Pauline Ray, to some extent, Vernon Wright, what they had, and it came about through experience, age, maturity, they had an enormous depth of background knowledge that what was happening now could be put into the context of what happened 20 years ago. And all of that was reflected in their work. It was like the coal miners and talking about the exhibition, but talking about a book as well. These writers, Vernon Wright and Tony Reid, kept saying that I should write it, which would come out in one way, but I feel, and looking at the South Africa thing and having a look at Vernon's writing for that, it's so powerful, so moving, and drawn on such an amazing depth of knowledge and depth of feeling about the issues and about the people, about Africa, about New Zealand, about the whole thing, that there's no way that I could do what they would do because of their sort of, not just their knowledge, I mean their skill at using that knowledge and linking it up. And I'm just getting to a stage now where I'm beginning to see links between Roburn and Motlanthe in South Africa. It's only just beginning to sort of make sense now. And I suppose it's funny, I remember there was a photographer, Don McCullum, you would know, who I remember reading somewhere about him saying that, this was just a few years ago, he said it, that he presumed that everything would get clearer as time went on, but 20 years on he found that he was more confused than ever. And I got telephoned by a New Zealand photographer, whose name I won't mention, I'm not sure if he's here or not, the other day, who said that he said it was very exciting to know exactly what he was doing and why. And I thought, goodness, there's something on here. And it's only as you go on and on and on and continue to explore and challenge your own ideas and own motives and own thoughts that you, I think, begin to sort of make sense of what you're doing. In some ways, the sort of situation that I'm in now, I can step back from it all and look back and sort of start off on something quite different. And that's what, in showing those colour images, that might be the sort of next sort of step.
So in fact, documentary photography, which traditionally, as you implied, does tend to be seen as being objective primarily, which to give us information about the world. In practice, you feel ultimately that your work is telling you more about yourself, in fact, than about those things that you photograph, or how would you express that?
Yeah, I'm not so sure that people could look through all of those photographs and get much idea about my personality or about me. Perhaps they can in the sorts of things that I've photographed. But
Isn't
I-
there
I-
something in those photographs, sorry if I just jump in there, that it seems to me what you've been sort of suggesting is that there's something in those photographs about the way you see the issues that are involved in the photographs.
yeah, sure.
And that's what's important.
Yeah.
That's what's the editors have been stuffing around with.
Yeah. But see, to me, that's the same with anyone. The same with anyone. It's the same in a Herald editorial. It's just a different opinion. And this is the point I was making about objectivity and subjectivity. Sorry?
It's just a different medium though, isn't it? I mean, with words, it's fairly, you can make them as obvious as possible, but with a photograph, it's going to speak for itself. In the
Yeah,
eyes of the
yeah.
beholder.
Yeah, I think you should make distinctions about the types of photographs too. There are, I mean, much of the newspaper photography that's done in New Zealand, and not all of it, because there is some quite fine stuff. You don't see it very often, but there are some quite fine photographers within the newspapers who are really oppressed by the whole system. Their work mostly, and it's what's required, is of an illustrative shallowness. It's not meant to comment. It's not meant to suggest anything beyond who, why, what, when, and where. And I find that disappointing, because that doesn't need to be that way in a newspaper. And yet, if you've got something like the Herald, which is commercially very successful, you can see why I say that their approach is the bias of the status quo. They don't want to change it because they're making the money.
I wrote a quote down from an article written about you in the newspaper, and you said,
God, what did
take
they say?
photos first, intellectualise afterwards.
Yeah, it's which cuts across something of what John was saying before, the research. And while I certainly think about what I'm doing, I don't go out and read enormous quantities of material at all.
Wouldn't you get burned out if you did that? You said, well, I know it all.
Yeah, well, I think you'd start looking for things. I mean, I remember John gave me a copy of Road to Wigan Pier, because chapter 2 is this story about being underground in a coal mine. And I didn't read it before I went down in 1981. I read it when I came back. But it was very much as I saw it. I mean, it was a glorified account of coal miners. There's no doubt about that. And it's been questioned, and I imagine a lot of Orwell's work has been questioned since. But yeah, when I said that, taking the South Africa exhibition, what you're trying to do, and same with the coal miners as well, what I've tried to do is go out and be very loose in a way about what I photograph and how I photograph. I'm quite happy to photograph from a car as I'm zipping along the road, or do a very formal sort of portrait. Anything goes. That's what I'm trying to do.
Otherwise you can photograph with bias, can't you? If you're not loose, as you just said, you can just concentrate on something that's important to you, instead of covering things.
Yeah, well, I do that anyway. I think just the nature of me, but of anyone doing the same sort of thing. You'll cover the things that you want to cover, and the things that mean things to you. But what it did in being away from the magazine, it allowed other things to be considered by me to photograph. Putting it all together, finally, I never thought how it could work as an exhibition or a book or a magazine or anything like that. And in photographing the mills, I saw them as two completely separate projects. And I spent a lot of time, everywhere I went, I would take my camera and I would photograph. I photographed in Greymouth and Reefton, in the forests, everywhere. And there are all sorts of oddball photographs amongst it all. But I think as I start to print them up, I'll do a whole series of work prints, and then the intellectualizing, if you like, will take place. You begin to link them all together. And the most extraordinary things happen if you allow that process to happen. The most extraordinary sort of juxtapositionings occur. I mean, I can see photographs that were taken underground being put next to I don't know, someone clipping a hedge or that kid waving to the bus on the side of the road, all of that sort of thing. It's getting away from the simple sort of narrative, starting off in the morning, at breakfast time, and working your way through until they go to sleep at night. It's getting away from that, because I think that unsophisticated way of looking at it bores people now. I think they don't respond to that. And I think, well, I don't think there's any hope of me becoming a postmodernist. It's that sort of avoidance of narrative, or obvious narrative, that I'm sort of looking for. I went down to Elam the other day to give a talk, not to give a talk, to do a critique of a project that the students had been given to do on, I think it was photojournalism, wasn't it, John? And it was interesting to see all the different approaches. There was the classic Life magazine listener type approach, and then there were others that were completely different from that. And there was a whole series of portraits, I remember, which were very powerful, of a particular cult or group of people. And it was just a different way of looking at a particular subject than the traditional Life magazine way. But there was one chap who photographed a triathlon, and what he had done, the triathlon, was suburban landscapes. I think it was in Auckland, but it was Auckland landscapes with the triathlon in the middle of it, and all of them. Now, whether he'd consciously gone out to photograph suburban landscapes with triathlon runners, and I don't know, but that's what had happened. And there were 5 or 6 photographs out of the 10 or 12, I think there may have been 10 or so, that were in the spread, that were real classics of suburban New Zealand. I mean, and it was getting to that sort of ordinariness of New Zealand that I really love, and there it all was. And it was just a completely different approach to some of the others that were there.
There's one general question which I've been wanting to ask, but you've actually more or less answered it several times, but not quite. And that is...
that sounds like me, Ian. Skirting around.
And that is the use of power, the use of your power to influence an audience in what you're wanting to do, or how you want to affect the world and this sort of thing. One of the reasons why I'm actually quite conscious of this, especially in this lecture tonight, and that I've spent today actually travelling across New Zealand with a guy in a brand new Mercedes-Benz, listening to him tell me about how the world has been totally corrupted by media people, and how really South Africa really is a media issue, and all the other issues have been generated by people who are left-wing and liberal in their middle class and their values, and how they've gone out to present the world and influence the world through their eyes by excising the right things out of what they're seeing.
But I think
it applies to what you
yeah, to a certain extent, he's right. And let's use South Africa as an example. In one of the funerals we went to was in Ciskei, a village called Rai. It was the funeral of Victoria McKinley, who had been murdered. And it was a huge political funeral. And the world's press turned up. Everyone was there. There must have been 5 or 6 camera crews and probably about 60, 70 journalists and photographers altogether. And it was a real circus. And what they... After the necklace killing had happened, and they couldn't get very close to it because there was a lot of tension at that stage, all of them left and took off to meet their 3 o'clock deadlines or whatever they were to link up with around the world. We stayed back, and I'm not suggesting that we're any better than they are, but we stayed back. I mean, Vernon wanted to go off chasing buses first because he heard buses were going to get shot up, and I said that I wasn't very keen to do that at all. But what he was waiting for was for the police and troops from Ciskei Defence Force, and this was one of their number that had been killed, to come back. What happens and I'll use, there's a Time magazine photographer who was an absolute oaf in the way that they approached things and dealt with people. And it was interesting to actually be there over a period of time where you could get Newsweek or Time magazine or other magazines and actually read what had happened at a situation you had been at, and not even resemble what had happened there. So in that way, he's quite right. Quite right. I mean, what you're dealing with, people who one have got a job and they have to earn money, and to earn money they've got to get the words and they've got to meet deadlines, and all those require certain compromises in the way they collect their material and the way it's finally used. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, really. My approach is a little bit different, but similar, because it's my point of view, just as their point of view is what has been sent across, despite Time trying to change it into a sort of international language. I'm less and less do I feel that the South Africa book, when it comes out, and the exhibition and the magazine articles won't affect South Africa even remotely, not in the remotest sense will it affect what goes on there. Nothing. And this is where I keep coming back in this trying to work out why I photograph, to the idea that it's personal exploration. I'm going there to learn for myself. And I do learn. What I actually photograph might be of use to other people, it might not. In some ways, I don't care whether it is. I mean, it might sound an extraordinary thing to say, but really, it's like that book coming out. In some ways, it'll be for just me to look at, because it was a period of my life where I really learnt an awful lot about all sorts of things, and am able to relate all that I learnt to now and future and past. I don't think I've ever been a crusader at all.
Except Roburn.
Well, Roburn was the early romantic age, you see, when... but see, no, not even there, really, John. I mean, in some ways, looking back at the way I approached that, finally, when I photographed in the 3.5 weeks I was there, was no different from the way I did it in South Africa. It was exactly the same. I may have thought that it would have had more effect or whatever, or may have been useful to the world, I don't know, but I certainly don't think that now. No, I think the media are overstated entirely.
It's just that in spite of your activity and everybody else's activity, amongst the group of people who are taking those sort of photographs in New Zealand and everywhere else in the world, there is a desire to influence the final audience. I mean, look at David Cook's photography on the wall. He's doing exactly the same sort of thing. And I actually wonder whether it's a good, what is the function and why people do it and that sort of thing. It's just a question that I have, and it is a valid thing to worry about.
Yeah, well, I constantly ask myself that, and I still haven't come up with any sound answers. See, just talking about overstating the media, I went to a book launch the other night. Rhondda Walker's book came out, which was 10 years of writing his column in The Listener about issues involving the Maori and Pākehā in New Zealand. Now, after all the speeches were given, the last person to speak was Titawhai Harawira. Now, Titawhai said David Beetson was there, and he actually spoke. He was put on the spot and asked to speak, and he spoke. And Titawhai addressed it to him to start with, and said that you have... she said something like, it's fine to write about it. It's fine to write about it, but being out in the action is a lot more fun. But she said, sure, everyone's more aware of what the problems are, but she said nothing has changed. Nothing has changed with the Maori. She said, in fact, we're going to lose a bit more land soon. Nothing has changed, despite all the awareness and all the media and all the writing. And that's pretty depressing. You know, I'm not cynical about the media or about photography or about journalism or books, but I don't hold it up perhaps the way that I once held it up. I don't, you know, you were involved in Whirinaki Forest. Well, just how instrumental, I don't know whether you've sort of sat down and worked all that out, how instrumental your book was in getting the forest, as the Forest Service people would say, locked up. I don't know.
But I don't think it's done much for the North Island work situation.
Yeah. Mm.
But no, I think there's a considerable power. I think there is a considerable power. We're involved in publishing and especially in television and in photojournalism. And I actually often do wonder whether there is that realisation amongst us practitioners that in fact a lot of things do get changed. And in this country, especially with the Springbok tour situation, with the nuclear situation, a lot of that was done with photojournalism. And whether there is, whether sort of, which comes first, the sort of this consciousness within the society or the left class. I mean, but those are the sort of issues that I'm becoming more and more aware, more and more concerned about. I think there's no reason to change anything, but I think that's it.
Yeah, they should be challenged and questioned, but I've got an enormous faith in word of mouth, more so than the media, to change things, if you like, if you think things should be changed. I mean, I remember going on the Hikoi in 1984, and it being a very common thing to say that they kicked the journalists out, and they said, we don't need the media. And this is in some ways what, I mean, South Africa is a little bit different in a way, but as the black people there said, that they will change it, no one else. You know, it won't be Reagan that changes it, or it won't be Thatcher or Longy or anything like that. They'll change it. Governments come and governments go, but their fight has been going on for years. And that's what I mean, that the media might sort of be able to bring it all out and show it to people around the world. And they can sit in their lazy boy chairs and watch it all on television and get enraged. But it's just like me going across there and photographing and Vernon and I doing a book. It's not going to change something in South Africa at all. Not even remotely. It might make people, as Titafai said, more aware. And that's here. Some people here who buy the book, more aware of what's going on there and just how obscene the whole thing is. But it's not going to affect South Africa or rugby players. That's what I mean. The media is sort of overstated in that way, I feel. I mean, we see all the television pictures coming, and apartheid will be around for another 20 years at least. And the only time it'll go is when the blacks put it together.
Could be sooner. People said the same thing about Iran.
Yeah, well, that's true. And about
Military,
Rhodesia,
the military
Zimbabwe.
there was a huge amount. People said out for years before there could be a revolution. It took everyone on a reason outside Iran.
But this is all part of the process, isn't it? That awareness and what artists and photographers do is forming that awareness. Change doesn't just happen.
Yeah.
It happens through awareness, and that all takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's all part of the process, and the process is a very long process. And if you understand that, it saves you getting despondent and depressed.
That awareness has to be started, that process has to be started somewhere. And it's that personal awareness and that word of mouth which is started by those perhaps media things. It may not affect the actual issue, but it affects people's point of view. And people by their own word of mouth, by their own work, their own decisions and their own lives.
I think you'll find that they're all sort of intertwined. Everything's sort of happening at the same time. All add their little bit. I mean, that's usually...
One doesn't exist without the other.
Yeah,
It's part of the jigsaw.
Eugene Smith understood that, and in his Minamata series, I don't know whether people know about that, the book that he did on a Japanese fishing village that was poisoned by mercury, he did a book on it. The pictures were used in newspapers, magazines. They were allowed to be used anywhere. They were used everywhere. And the book did one thing, exhibitions did another thing, magazine and newspaper articles did something else. And he linked up politically with people in the States, and I mean, all just covered the whole thing. Didn't rely on any one particular method of communication.